Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the 2016 Drell Lecture. My name is David Relman. I am the Science Co-Director of the Center for International Security and Cooperation. And on behalf of my fellow co-director, Dr. Amy Ziegert, we are delighted that all of you have joined us here today. We are especially honored to have Secretary Bill Perry as this year's Drell Lecturer. Before I welcome Bill, who, by the way, prefers being called Bill, to the podium this afternoon, I'd like to extend a sincere note of appreciation to Albert, Bud, and Cicely Whelan, who established and endowed this lecture, the Drell Lecture, in 1994 in honor of Stanford physicist Sid Drell. They have supported the annual lecture and CSAC these past 22 years. Our dear friend Bud Whelan passed away in 2013, and he is greatly missed. CSAC brings together some exceedingly talented scholars from diverse disciplines to think about new ways of tackling difficult security issues in biology and public health, computer science and cybersecurity, nuclear nonproliferation, terrorism and insurgency, and many other issues that impact our increasingly interconnected world. Sid Drell, a noted theoretical physicist, was CSAC's founding science co-director, a recipient of the Enrico Fermi Award and the National Medal of Science, and is currently a professor emeritus at SLAC National Accelerator Laboratory. We are delighted that Sid is joining us here today. Bud, Sid, and Bill shared a lifetime of commitment to international security. In October 1962, Bill was asked by his colleague, Bud Whelan, then head of the CIA's Office of Scientific Intelligence, to fly to Washington to consult with him and provide analysis on whether the satellite images were, in fact, showing Soviet missiles deployed in Cuba. In addition to being a pioneer in digital image analysis, Bill's mathematical expertise allowed him to apply state-of-the-art statistical techniques to nuclear weapons exchange scenarios. In his new book, My Journey at the Nuclear Brink, a selective memoir about coming of age in the nuclear era, Bill states, "My calculations, which were meant to establish the plausibility of a defensive system against a nuclear attack, instead taught me that there is no acceptable defense against the destructive power of a mass nuclear attack. The only meaningful defense is to prevent the attack from happening." Bill remains in a long-lasting partnership with Sid Drell, and together with George Shultz, Sam Nunn, and Henry Kissinger, continues to work towards a world without nuclear weapons. Just a few words about the Drell Lecture and some additional words about this year's speaker. By tradition, the Drell Lecturer addresses a current and critical national or international security issue that has important scientific or technical dimensions. Over the years, the Drell Lecture Series has brought to Stanford some of the best minds working on international issues. Past speakers in this series include Vinton Cerf, Vice President and Chief Internet Evangelist for Google, Mohammed El-Baradei, the former Director General of the International Atomic Energy Agency, astronaut Sally Ride, Dr. Margaret Hamburg, former Commissioner of the Food and Drug Administration, and former Secretary of State George Shultz. Last year, we had a special Drell Lecture with Secretary of Defense Ashton Carter, former co-director with Bill Perry of the Preventive Defense Project. That was the first time an acting Secretary of Defense gave remarks at Stanford since Bill did over 20 years ago. Bill Perry has had an influential career spanning academia, government, and industry. He is the Michael and Barbara Berberian Professor Emeritus at Stanford University. He is a senior fellow at the Freeman Spogli Institute and the Hoover Institution and serves as director of the Preventive Defense Project. He was the co-director of CSAC from 1988 to 1993, during which time he was also a part-time professor at Stanford, and prior to that served as a part-time lecturer in the Department of Mathematics at Santa Clara University. Bill Perry was the 19th Secretary of Defense for the United States, serving from February 1994 to January 1997. He previously served as Deputy Secretary of Defense and as Undersecretary of Defense for Research and Engineering. Before high-level government service, he formed and was president of Electromagnetic Systems Laboratory, or ESL, and prior to that worked for over a decade at Sylvania, where he was director of their electronic defense laboratories. It was at ESL that Bill and his colleagues used Stanford's 150-foot satellite dish to detect Soviet radar signals bouncing off the moon, and by so doing, gained insight into the Soviet ballistic missile defense system. Bill received his bachelor's and master's degrees from Stanford and a PhD from Penn State University, all in mathematics. By any measure, Bill Perry has had an amazing career. To describe it adequately would take much more time than we have here this afternoon, but I do just want to touch on how Bill's early academic training in mathematics informed his perspective on tackling global security issues and shaped his approach to and love of teaching. In Bill's book, Nuclear Brink, he writes, "I was both awed by the purity and beauty of mathematics and inspired by the scholars at Stanford." As a master's student in the math department at Stanford, Bill wrote his thesis under George Poya, the world-famous mathematician known for his problem-solving techniques. Bill is quoted as having said, "I've never met, before or since, anyone quite like Poya. He exposed me to parts of mathematics that I had never seen before, and he was just a warm human being." Sound familiar? In the preface to his 1945 book, How to Solve It, Poya writes, "A teacher of mathematics has a great opportunity. If he fills his allotted time with drilling his students in routine operations, he kills their interest, hampers their intellectual development, and misuses his opportunity. But if he challenges the curiosity of his students by setting them problems proportionate to their knowledge and helps them to solve their problems with stimulating questions, he may give them a taste for and some means of independent thinking." It was under the kind and brilliant mentorship of Poya and as a TA during his master's program at Stanford that Bill further developed a mathematical, problem-solving way of thinking while discovering a love of teaching. By the way, Bill's master's thesis was entitled "On the Minkowski Constant for Special Convex Polyhedra." And I'm already thinking that perhaps he was, at that time, thinking about the Pentagon as a special case for a convex polyhedron. In fact, Poya was impressed enough with Bill's thesis to recognize him as having contributed to the topic of investigation in his 1951 book, Isoparametric Inequalities in Mathematical Physics. So, with a family to support and an attractive teaching position awaiting him at Penn State, Bill started his PhD program there with the intention of becoming a math professor. However, the start of the Cold War influenced his decision to focus on a career in defense electronics versus academia. While at Penn State, he began working part-time for a local defense company, Holler, Raymond, and Brown. Bill states in Nuclear Brink about this defense job, quote, "I quickly discovered that I enjoyed applying my mathematical skills to thorny problems in defense, and did it well." As a mathematician, Bill encourages, to this day, his students to think independently and problem solve, just as his mentor, Poya, had taught him to do. In 1981, at the invitation of then co-director and founder of CSAC, Professor John Lewis, Bill joined CSAC as a part-time senior fellow and created a new course called The Role of Technology and National Security. This course continues today, and until this year was co-taught for many years by Bill and Sig Hecker, also a CSAC senior fellow and professor in management science and engineering. Through this annual course, MS&E 193-293, Bill has helped innumerable students better understand the intersection of technology and national security policy. So, it is with enormous pleasure that I ask you to join me now in welcoming Bill Perry.
I want to thank David for that brilliant introduction, but mostly say how moved I was by the film about the students. I had not seen it before, and I was really very touched by it. On the eve of World War I, the Irish poet William Butler Yeats wrote, "In the stillness of the dark, all the dogs of Europe bark, and the living nations wait, each sequestered in its hate." Today, that poem could well be applied to the Mideast, where the nations wait, sequestered in their hate. But not just the Mideast. The dogs are barking in many other places of the world. Tonight I'm going to visit some of those nations where the barking could conceivably escalate into a nuclear catastrophe. Russia, China, North Korea, Iran, and Pakistan. My bottom line is that the likelihood of a nuclear catastrophe today is greater than it was during the Cold War. The rest of my talk will be establishing why I believe that. I'm going to start off with Russia. Russia, you must understand that I am, in fact, a Russophile. I love things Russian. I've visited Russia more than 30 times. I've led 4 Stanford study tours to Russia. I love their music. I love their literature. I love their art. I have many friends in Russia, some of them for more than 3 decades. But today I am very concerned about Russia. We are now in a period comparable to the dark days of the Cold War. How could we have let that happen? How? During the early 90s, the Soviet Union was dissolved. A very dangerous period followed. It could very well have led to a major conflict or civil war. Instead, it did not, and I give great credit to the Russian people for avoiding a catastrophic bloodshed. But they did suffer from a substantial economic collapse, and there were gross abuses in the privatizing of the state properties. There were many hardships for millions of Russians, particularly the elderly, as the pensions became worthless. Some of us proposed something like a Marshall Plan to help Russia through this difficult transition to democracy. But of course, that never happened. When I became Secretary of Defense, I had an opportunity to at least foster relations with the Russian military and work to bring Russia inside the Western security circle instead of outside throwing rocks at it. I invited the Russian Minister of Defense to attend the NATO meetings, which he did. We formed something called the Partnership for Peace, by which Russia and the other nations of the Warsaw Pact, former Warsaw Pact, were able to join together with NATO nations in joint peacekeeping exercises. We had many such exercises. We conducted joint military operations, not exercises, but operations in Bosnia. And where, with considerable difficulty, I was able to arrange for a Russian brigade to be a part of an American division, reporting to an American division commander in that operation. We jointly dismantled 4,000 nuclear weapons in the former Soviet Union. We jointly agreed to honor Ukrainian boundaries. This was, I think, the high point of US-Russian relations. I'm going to show you a few pictures to illustrate just what that was all about. This is the Russian Minister of Defense and I signing the agreement which allowed the Russian troops to operate under an American general in Bosnia. Look at that sign that he's holding up. It says, Russia plus NATO equals success. Russia plus NATO equals success. Can you imagine something like that being said today? And this is a picture of my visiting Bosnia and visiting the Russian brigade commander for the purpose of pinning a medal on him, recommended by the man to his left, which is General Bill Nash, the commander of the division in which he conducted his brigade. This is Pervomaisk, Ukraine, where we blew up all of the silos that had been there. This particular silo, before we blew it up, had a missile with 6 nuclear warheads, which at one time had all been targeted to the United States. And this is a sequence to that picture. The Russian Minister of Defense, the Ukrainian Minister of Defense, and the American Minister of Defense, all shaking hands and congratulating ourselves on what a good job we had done. So when I left the Pentagon, I believed we were well on the way to ending forever that Cold War enmity. But that was not to be. What happened? The first thing that happened is that NATO expanded right up to Russian borders, I believe prematurely, before Russia was quite willing to accept the fact that NATO was a partner instead of an enemy. The United States then went on to deploy ballistic missile defense systems right up to the border of Russia, which Russians believed threatened their nuclear deterrence. And of course, the US supported color revolutions in the Mideast. Putin, when he regained the presidency in 2012, believed that the US was in the process of supporting a color revolution in Russia, designed to overthrow him, which didn't please him very much. Ambassador McFaul, our own Stanford, Mike McFaul, had just been appointed ambassador at that time. He was right in the crucible of that ferment in Russia at the time. So the bad relations between the United States and Russia were partly stimulated by actions of the United States government. They were also, of course, stimulated by Putin, anxious to restore the power and the glory of the former Soviet Union, and all too willing to thumb his nose at the United States. The actions he took that manifested that were hugely popular in Russia, and still are hugely popular. He annexed Crimea. He threatened Ukraine. He threatened his neighbors in Europe with nuclear Iskander missiles based in Kaliningrad. And he indirectly threatened the United States. Dmitry Kiselov, the head of Russian media, made the following remarkable assertion in print. He said, Russia is the only country capable of turning the United States into radioactive ash. Happens to be true. What would inspire Putin's appointed head of media to make that statement publicly? Well, this bombast against the United States, I recognize, of course, is mostly rhetoric. What is not rhetoric is some of the actions they're taking. They're well along, well advanced in rebuilding their Cold War nuclear arsenal, and it is Putin's stated first priority. And they have dropped their former policy of no first use of nuclear weapons and replaced it with a policy that says nuclear weapons will be their weapon of choice if they are threatened. So they're playing a very aggressive game, but I must say they're playing it with a very weak hand. They have no significant allies. Their demographics is a disaster, with the population actually declining. And their economic situation is getting worse every year. Fundamentally, economically, Russia is a petro state. When oil was $100 a barrel, they prospered, but they did not use those resources to diversify. The oil revenues that provided the government funding and funded the social programs so important to many Russian people depended on those, simply depended on those oil revenues, which at $100 a barrel flowed readily. At $80 a barrel, they started to get into problems. At $30 a barrel, they are in really deep trouble. They've been eating into their cash reserves for over a year now. And those reserves may very well be completely depleted in another year of $30 oil. Well, that's a lot of trouble for Russia, but it is not good news for the United States, because Putin is diverting attention from these domestic problems by playing the national card. And that could lead to real danger. Putin, I'm quite convinced, does not want a military conflict with NATO or with the United States. I repeat, does not want that conflict. At the Baltics, he has a great geographic advantage, but everything else, all of the other fundamental advantages are with NATO. Stronger and more effective conventional military forces, stronger economy and larger economy, and much better technology. Those are fundamental advantages which are bound to prevail in any conflict. The danger then is not that Putin will seek a conflict, it is that he will take actions which cause him to blunder into a conflict. Any such conflict in time, Russia would lose, unless they decided to use their tactical nuclear weapons. That is, unless they did what they say they will do. If they did that, there's no way of predicting or controlling the escalation that would follow thereafter. And I must say, I do not like that scenario. With all of this good news from Russia, let me switch to China. China has had more than 10% growth now for almost 3 decades. But I think there's trouble ahead. In 2015, their growth dropped to 6.9%, the lowest it's been in 25 years. 6.9%, you say, I wish we had 6.9%. Many countries in the world would say that, but it is not enough for China. There are more than 100 million Chinese who are not yet enjoying the benefits of the prosperity that China has enjoyed these last few decades. More than 100 million, and each day they see on television the good life of the Chinese living in eastern China. Beyond that, they have minority problems in western China, which are leading to both social and political problems. And they have a serious pollution problem. Anybody that has been in Beijing, especially in the winter, can appreciate that. The pollution problem is turning into a political problem for the government. So the government needs a safety valve. The time-proven safety valve for any government that's in trouble is ultra-nationalism, which in the case of China translates into anti-Americanism and anti-Japanese. And it could lead, in fact is leading, to some military adventures. The backdrop of all this is they've had a major growth the last decade or so in their military expenditures. They are forming a blue water navy, and they're developing very effective anti-ship missiles, all designed to drive the US Navy hundreds of miles back from the Chinese coastline. On the other hand, the US Navy does not intend to be driven back 100 miles or more from their coastline. And so that's a scenario for a potential conflict. One specific activity is the building of artificial islands and the reefs in the South China Sea. In a sense, China is regarding the South China Sea as a domestic lake, and we regard it, and most other countries regard it, as international waters. So their actions have been challenged by the US Navy and will be challenged again. So that's scenario 2 for confrontation with China. I have to say I'm generally optimistic that we will find a way to work these conflicts, to work these issues out without a military conflict. The stakes are so huge, and both governments realize the stakes are so huge. Still, though, I do not like those scenarios, because I still worry about wandering into some kind of a conflict. Now let me pivot to China's neighbor, North Korea. During the 90s, I spent many a day, many hours trying to develop a non-nuclear North Korea, working within our own government, working with allies, working with the North Koreans. Well, what can I say? I failed. North Korea is today building a nuclear arsenal also. And I would say clearly it's of highest priority in their government. And they have adopted outrageous rhetoric about how they might use those nuclear weapons. Some years ago, when I was in Pyongyang meeting with the government, on my first night there, I met with the president and asked, he showed me the schedule and I reviewed it and said, it's not satisfactory. You don't have any meetings for me with your top military people. I was the Secretary of Defense. I want to meet with some of your military people. So the president nodded, and the next morning, as I sat down for the meeting, the door opened and in walks a North Korean general, just as I requested. He walked over and we shook hands, and he said, I'm General so-and-so. He said, this meeting is not my idea. I was directed to meet with you. He said, I don't think we should be even talking about giving up nuclear weapons. So I said, why are nuclear weapons so important to you? He said, to defend ourselves. I said, from whom? And he looked at me incredulously, from you. I like a person that talks straight. He just. And then he went on and said, this was back during the days when we were bombing Serbia. NATO was bombing Serbia. And he said, if you drop bombs on Pyongyang, you will find nuclear weapons going off in your own cities. Pause, not excluding Palo Alto. He'd done his homework, too. The meeting actually turned out to be pretty good after that rocky beginning. Well, that was bluster. That was bluster then. But since then, they've actually built an arsenal of medium-range ballistic missiles capable of reaching both South Korea and all of Japan. And they're developing ICBMs, which could threaten the United States. These missiles today have only conventional warheads, so they're no significant concern. But they are developing nuclear warheads. They already have developed a nuclear bomb, and the latest tests and tests to come will be designed to perfect a bomb small enough and compact enough and durable enough to fit into a warhead. If they succeed in doing that, then the bluster will become a real threat. So what to do about that, aside from wringing our hands and making speeches? Professor Hecker has proposed what he calls his 3 no's. Back off trying to get them to simply agree to give up the nuclear weapons as being a bridge too far right now. But get them instead to agree no more nuclear weapons, no better nuclear weapons, and no transfer of nuclear technology. If we could get those 3 agreements, that would be a step forward. However, neither administration, neither the Bush nor the Obama administration, has followed that approach. I expect more acting out in the next few months, more satellite ICBM testing, more nuclear testing. The sanctions which we do have on North Korea are largely ineffective. That it makes uncomfortable a number of common people in North Korea, but it's not effective in affecting their policies. The reason being they have China as a safety valve. China continues to provide food and fuel, which keeps the sanctions from biting too hard. So we're not on a path to solution. It's a festering sore, and if it erupts, it would very likely entail some use of nuclear weapons. I do have one faint hope on North Korea, and that is if China and the United States could agree on a common negotiating strategy, which I think is possible, then we could agree on a joint program to contain their nuclear weapons, basically a program organized around Sig Hecker's 3 no's. China, in the last year or so, is beginning to show substantial concern for the North Korean nuclear program. So it might be time for a quiet, and I emphasize quiet, U.S. probe to China. If we did this, our diplomats, American diplomats, will have to be very careful to avoid the blame game. That is, blaming all the problems in North Korea on China. I must say there's plenty of blame to go around for the unacceptable situation in North Korea today. The next walk around the world takes me to Iran. For many decades, Iran has had a robust nuclear program oriented around civil nuclear work. But in the last 5 or more years, it's looked more and more like part of this program might be a cover for a weapon program, just as North Korea had used their commercial program for cover for their weapon program. So about 5 or so years ago, Sig Hecker and I met with the Iranian National Security Advisor. We listened very carefully to what he had to say. He said they didn't want nuclear weapons, they were not pursuing nuclear weapons, which sounded good but did not really jibe with what we were observing as facts on the ground. So I don't think either Sig or I were very encouraged by those discussions. But then 2 big changes occurred in the government. One of them was Iran elected a new president, much more reasonable than the Ahmadinejad, whom he succeeded. And perhaps more significantly, serious sanction programs were brought to bear on Iran, not like the ones in North Korea. These were sanction programs that were followed by all the leading nations of the world, including China and including Russia, and they really bit. They hurt Iran quite seriously. So with those 2 changes, Iran began talking a different story. We met again, this time with the Iranian foreign minister, again in track 2, or unofficial meetings. And I at least was very hopeful with what Minister Zarif was telling me. Thought there was a chance that we might be able to make an arrangement satisfactory to everybody. At about that time, a serious track 1 negotiations, serious political negotiations began to take place, and Sig and I dropped out of the track 2 of the unofficial negotiations. Well, after several years, really a long, hard slog of negotiations, they did cut a deal last year. It was a better deal than I thought we would get based on my discussions. Nevertheless, there has been, as you all know, passionate opposition to that deal. The major opposition to the deal comes from what I would consider to be strange bedfellows. They are the Prime Minister Netanyahu, 55% of the American Congress, and Iran's Revolutionary Guard. The irony here is that the opposition in Israel and the United States oppose the deal because they fear it will allow Iran to get a bomb, whereas the opposition in Iran opposes the deal because they fear it will prevent Iran from getting a bomb. Both cannot be right. The opposition in the United States has a simple formula. We should withdraw from the deal, we should reinstate sanctions, and we should renegotiate a better deal. This is a fantasy. Let me be as blunt as I can. This is a pure fantasy. There is not the remotest possibility that the sanctions could be reapplied if the United States withdraws from this deal. Because the day we withdraw from the deal, our allies are gone, the sanctions are gone, there'll be no negotiations without sanctions. So this deal, like it or not, is the only deal we will ever get. I've saved the bad news for the end, and that's Pakistan. Pakistan has had 3 wars with India, all of which they've lost. And they have since then reverted to what I would call irregular warfare. Both India and Pakistan now, since those 3 wars, now have nuclear weapons. I would say more than 100 in each country, and the missiles to fire them. In addition, Pakistan has well-funded, well-trained terror groups, some of which at least have some connection with the government, although the government the connection continues to be shadowy and hard to prove. You are all familiar with the Mumbai attack, which was one of the large-scale terror attacks in the world conducted on Mumbai a few years ago. At that time, India, though outraged, showed commendable restraint. We've had here at Stanford in the last couple of years about 3 meetings with Pakistanis and Indians, sometimes together in the room, talking about the future. And all of them worry about what they envision as a Mumbai 2, in other words, a follow-on terror. No, it's not necessarily Mumbai, of course, it might be in Delhi, for example. They believe, the Pakistanis believe, that there are groups in Pakistan planning such an attack as we speak. The Indians believe that if that happened, that this time they would not show restraint. The Indian government would mount a punitive military expedition into Pakistan. The Pakistanis then say what would happen in that case would be that Pakistan would respond, their army losing again, would respond with tactical nuclear weapons. They would use the tactical nuclear weapons, they say, only in Pakistan against the Indian troops who are in Pakistan, thinking that that would not provoke a nuclear response on the point of India. And the Indian representatives say they are wrong. It would provoke a nuclear response. And so this is the nightmare of how a regional nuclear war could start. A nightmare that involved literally tens of millions of deaths, along with the possibility of stimulating a nuclear winter that would cause widespread tragedies all over the planet. So it is clear that the end of the Cold War was not quite the end of history. I'm going to summarize now for you now the present nuclear dangers which I've talked about. The first one is a nuclear war occurring by accident or by miscalculation. During the Cold War, we used to think that the Soviet Union was planning a nuclear attack. Nobody thinks that now about Russia. So the worry is about a war occurring by accident or miscalculation. Those dangers ended with the ending of the Cold War, but they are now returning. And they could become more dangerous as both the US and Russia continue with the rebuilding of their nuclear arsenals. The second danger is a regional nuclear war. That danger did not really exist during the Cold War, but now it is very real. And an India-Pakistan war would be the poster child for that. And the third danger is nuclear terrorism. Again, that danger didn't really exist during the Cold War. Now it is very real and much, much more dangerous than most people understand. I opened my book with a hypothetical scenario of a nuclear terror attack. I'm going to share this scenario with you now in a cartoon form, which our project prepared recently. Buried deep under these bone-dry high plains, in a covert section of a massively hardened centrifuge facility, a team is hard at work. They are members of a breakaway faction of the country's security forces, and they are busy enriching 40 kilograms of uranium. By July 3rd, they achieve their target of 90% enrichment, and then transfer the uranium to a nearby secret lab. where another team of technicians assembles it into a crude nuclear bomb. On August 31, they finished their work. They put the bomb in a packing crate labeled agricultural equipment and transport it to a nearby airfield where it is stored in a warehouse. 2 weeks later, it is removed and loaded onto an aircraft with civilian air cargo markings. It flies to Dubai, where the crate is transferred, along with other goods and equipment, to a global air transport freighter. Destination: Washington, D.C. The plane lands at Washington's Dulles International Airport at 2:47 a.m. on September the 15th. By late afternoon, the crate is delivered to a warehouse in the southeast part of the district. Then, before daybreak, on September the 17th, the bomb is removed from the crate and loaded onto a delivery truck. Several hours later, an American citizen eases the truck out into traffic. She drives it to a location on Pennsylvania Avenue, midway between the White House and the Capitol building. At 11:09 a.m., she stops in the middle of traffic, climbs down onto the street, and triggers the detonator. The bomb explodes with a power of 15 kilotons. There are more than 80,000 instant deaths, including the President, the Vice President, the Speaker of the House, and the 320 members of Congress present when the bomb goes off. There are also more than 100,000 seriously wounded, and virtually no place to treat them. Telecommunication facilities throughout the greater Washington area have gone down. Soon, cable news is broadcasting scenes of vast devastation from the Capitol. A short time later, all major news outlets report receiving an identical message. The message claims that 5 more bombs are hidden in 5 different cities across the country. It says one of these bombs will be set off each week for the next 5 weeks, unless all American troops based overseas are ordered to return immediately to the U.S. homeland. The nation is hurled into panic. Everything begins shutting down. Within a half hour, the stock market drops more than 70% before trading is halted. From coast to coast, masses of people begin to stream out of cities, no matter their size or location. There is widespread gridlock. Cell phone systems are soon overwhelmed, and calls cannot go through. Internet access is impossible in many regions, and the nation is now in a constitutional crisis. By succession, the Senate President pro tem is now the country's president. But he is being treated for pancreatic cancer far from the Capitol at the Mayo Clinic. The Secretary of Defense and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, both of whom were testifying to the House Armed Services Committee on their recent budget request, are dead as well. Martial law is declared in Washington and surrounding regions, and the next day, the entire country. There is widespread looting and violence in many cities. Federal and National Guard troops are mustered. Soon there are reports of troops firing on crowds. There are increasing numbers of reports of rioting against immigrants and foreigners. Within days, the military begins to construct large detention centers around the country. I'm going to return to the bottom line that I started my talk with. Today, the danger of some sort of a nuclear catastrophe is greater than it was during the Cold War. And most people are blissfully unaware of this danger. Therefore, our policies and our actions do not adequately reflect the dangers. Many of you have read My Journey at the Nuclear Brink. The purpose of that book and the purpose of this lecture is to educate the public on today's nuclear dangers and to promote policies which can reduce those dangers. Well, much of my talk today has a doomsday ring to it. But that truly is not who I am. I'm basically an optimist. When I see a cloud, I look for a ray of sun to shine through that cloud. My ray of sunshine, my hope, is I believe we can still reverse the slide in U.S.-Russia relations. We must begin that by restoring civil dialogue. We must restore cooperation between the United States and Russia in areas where we have mutual interests. That is what I am working for. If we succeed in doing that, then we can work to stop and reverse the drift to a greater and greater dependence on nuclear weapons. I've been asked, why do you spend your golden years pursuing such an unlikely outcome? Aren't you being a naive idealist pursuing such unrealistic goals? My answer is borrowed from Andrei Sakharov. In his latter years, he worked for political reform in the Soviet Union. What a hopeless task that must have seemed. Friends wrote to him, "You're being too idealistic," and he replied, and I quote, "There is a need to create ideals, even when you cannot see a path to achieving them. Because when there are no ideals, then there is no hope." Sakharov pursued his ideals. He kept hope alive in the Soviet Union for major political reforms. And that is the message on which I end. We must pursue our ideals in order to keep alive our hope. Hope for a safer world for our children and for our grandchildren. I thank you.